I think I'd just like to add to Lara's introduction to say that I'm sitting here between two of my very favourite writers, contemporary writers, and I think great writers, and I think you will know this as soon as you open page 1, or maybe page 2 of their books. I think you know it instantly. And so it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here. And this discussion about modernism, I mean, you know, I'm now getting quite old, and we've been having this discussion recurringly over my lifetime. And one of the accusations has always been that the British, ever since James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, no longer do modernism, whereas the French, the Italians, the Latin Americans all do modernism. I'm not sure what that means, and maybe in the course of this discussion we'll begin to understand what we might or might not mean by that. We're going to start with short, I think, commented readings with comment by our two guests. And first of all, we're reversing the gender order today. What is modernism? Is it literary? Is it historical? Is it you?
Candle to light you to Kwang! Here comes a chopper. Kwang! Leslie, Usna thinks. Bloody Leslie, playing the kid's guitar. But there ought to be another expression. Playing being what Gould does with a Steinway, or Dupre with a cello. Ow, 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 ow! The clawed chord howls in the hallway and tears up the stairs. It's not playing, Usna decides. It's mucking about. That's what he's doing. Mucking about with his mucky hands, one of which throttles the guitar's neck, twisting its steely chords so that they yow, wow, wow. This too, Usna suffers as he also endures the crack of his tap-tap wing of the flat body, Demoiselle de Willesden, being laid down on the bare boards of the downstairs back room the kid and Leslie share. Not an ideal arrangement, that. Mercifully, Leslie's roll-up stained fingers twiddle the knurled knob of the little Marshall amplifier so the static genie flies. I no longer dream of her. Usna cocks an ear for a while longer, expecting to hear the pet sounds of Oscar, the house dog, who often responds to guitar feedback with his own, but there's nothing. The lucky beast, Usna thinks, must have managed to doze through it, and so he resumes his humble task. He looks to the claw-footed bathtub, the chipped enamel sides and seaweedy stains trailing below the tacks, suggesting to him a tramp steamer turned inside out. His wrinkled fingertips, flattiboots, but recently trawled from it, pinch the dimpled handle of the safety razor and twist, but it resists until he receives the support of heavy bombers, massive artillery, a superb logistics system, nearly 1,000 helicopters, and about 10,000 men. His capacity for recall, Usna believes, has greatly improved since he stopped taking notes during analytic sessions, allowing them instead to develop as they will, free form, without the imposition of those prejudicial categories implicit in the logos, bearing down on all these wriggling little thought-fish. And yet, he muses, can it really be that they still call it a fish hook? Yes, a fish hook sailing to Cambodia some 20 miles long and 10 miles deep. The exact wording returns to him, and he sighs, satisfied, as he separates the two halves of the razor's head and eases out the old blade. You're more likely to cut yourself doing this, he thinks, as he bends to fill a bit of toilet paper from the wonky roller, than shaving. Okay, so that's the beginning of this novel, Shark. And what can I say about it? You may have noticed that, in common with the High Modernists, the passage incorporates direct thought, reported thought, sound, external, memory. There's no actual external dialogue in that passage, but if there were, it would also be incorporated into the same line. And yes, I'm not keen on what Jimmy J called perverted commas. I don't like to use them for speech, or at any rate, since I've shifted into this particular way of writing. You may also have caught the reference to Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, or you may not. I just put that into wine critics up, actually. I put quite a lot of things into my books nowadays that I've started using some of the techniques of the modernists, just to wine critics up. Why? And this is basically what I have to say to you. If you are a writer and you write books about books, you're a pretty shit writer. But your critic can't write books, can't write fiction, usually. Some do, but the majority don't. And the critic has spent all of her or his life sitting there reading books. And it's professional closure. So they can't really look at the text except in terms of contextuality. They've forgotten that books are actually about the world. So they tend to think books are about other books, because they've been studying them for so long, they've got really confused. So if you just put a couple of little references to the modernists in your book, then they think that the reason why you're using these techniques in your novel is because you've been really influenced by Juritz, or you've been really influenced by Eliot, or you've been really influenced by Ginny Wolfe, or whatever the fuck it is. And it's just bollocks. Because, the reason why I decided to write in the continuous present, the reason why I decided to abandon an omniscient narrator, and the reason why I decided to integrate dialogue, thought, everything else into a single unbroken line of prose is because that's what life is like. My life is always now. It's not then. Will didn't sit at King's College talking to a group of people. I'm doing it right now. It's always now. Okay? When people speak to me, they don't have quotation marks around what they say. I often find it difficult to distinguish between interiority and exteriority. I expect you do as well. You're probably wishing that I was a figment of your imagination. Perhaps I am. So all of these responses to the problem of how to write about the world, not about other texts, are emotional responses, because the reasons we write are emotional reasons. They're not intellectual reasons. You sit there and think, I'm going to do a piece of writing because of this idea or that idea. It's going to be a shit piece of writing. Yeah? The reason we write, the reason we want to be writers is because we feel and we want to articulate our feelings. So my reasons for taking up these techniques is I think they're better than a third-person narrator. I think they're better than the simple past, or any other tense for that matter. I think the whole kind of diacritical apparatus of the 19th century so-called naturalistic novelist is pretty redundant. And I think it was redundant in 1914 when Jimmy J sat down to write Ulysses. And it's still redundant now. And I also slightly, all writing now is modernist, actually, because that's the literary era we're living in. It didn't end.
It hasn't ended. It's still going on. It's a living tradition. Its inception comes in the late 19th century as a response to massive technological changes. Joyce and Ulysses is registering the impact of Einstein's second paper on special relativity. The movements of Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom around Dublin, and the preoccupation in that novel, it's not really a novel, book, with the notion of the parallax, is because Joyce understood the implications of relativity for perception of space-time. I mean, not that I'm not perfectly confident, but I don't think Ian McEwan really understands the implications of the unified space-time fiction. So modernism is a creative response to really important changes in science, in technology, in communications. Again, back to Ulysses, the gramophone that Bloom imagines being implanted in the graves so that you can hear your great-grandfather talking, or his description of the trams. This is an apprehension of the major changes, not just physical but psychic, that are underway. You know what? Those changes are still going on. They haven't gone away. How else are we to register the inception of bidirectional digital media, the web and the internet, if not with a prose or with an artistic response that appreciates their immanence in our culture? So, postmodernism is something that happens in architecture, and it's discreditable. Okay, it's the adaptation of details from previous forms and sticking them on facades and gussying up buildings, because architects have run out of imagination. And it's the same with postmodernism and any other artistic era. R.M. Adams, the critic, said postmodernism, that's a bit quick. That's a bit quick. That's a bit quick, postmodernism, because modernism has only lasted like 35 years, and here comes postmodernism. What's that really about? Every other major aesthetic era in Western civilization has lasted around 500 years. How come modernism only gets 30 or 40? That's got to be bollocks, right? Postmodernism is like marketing. It's like marketing. It doesn't mean anything. Don't pay any attention to it. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. If somebody tells me they're a postmodernist, I just leave. Because they don't know shit from China. Because modernism is still going on. Yes, I am one of those people who believe that, particularly in the English literary world, there has been a resiling from what modernism asks of us. And why do I think in the English-speaking world there's been such a turning away from it? Imperialism, in a nutshell. It's all part of the kind of biscuit tin, oh God bless the Queen, oh let's get our red jackets and our busbies on. It's all part of that, let's invade Iraq again, just so we can get a little kind of hard on for our kind of status in the world. And the rejection of modernism is all part of that. Jimmy J understood that the British Empire was finished, even though he took a pension from it. Good on him, I suppose. But everybody else who clings to the idea of this right tight little island punching above its weight on the international stage likes to revive Victorian novel forms and literary forms because it makes them feel comfortable in tradition and all of those things. And it's just nonsense. What about the Americans? I don't know what about the Americans. I think that they probably are participating in that imperial project as well. Modernism doesn't sit well with imperialism. It's not by nature an invasive form. It's a form that registers change. It's not a propagandizing form in that sense. I would argue, and I'd be interested to see what anybody else has to say about it, that modernism is the true naturalism. That's pretty much all I have to say.
Can I that puts down a lot of things for future questions, but can I just ask you one more?
All right.
Now, which is a privilege. I want to hear a little bit about how you sat down to write Umbrella and sharp, because it seems to me that the process in which you sit down and write a book, which is all one long sentence, or perhaps several paragraphs, and the process with which the human voice is registered on the page, translated through you somehow on the page, is perhaps different than it might be when you're writing what you call a naturalist novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the minute you introduce perverted commas, and the minute you hit return, and the minute you hit the tab to indent, then actually you are imposing a formal property on the idea of representing consciousness that is kind of alien to it. I mean, if you look at kind of what I notice when I go back to reading novels or texts that are not registering the impact of these modernist conventions, and of course they are conventions just like any other, is that there is something very stale about the dialogue. I kind of can't really believe in it. You notice how in novels nobody ever talks over each other. They always speak in discrete statements. If you notice how in the bulk of novels, most of the characters, you know, it was said of Joyce that he forced the reader into the bedroom and the bathroom, and the reader then ran screaming out again. Sort of, well, you know, I still, on rare occasions, I read contemporary fiction, nobody takes a shit, nobody wanks, nobody, you know, no really, it really doesn't happen that much. It's still, most fictional characters still seem to have no genitals and to be mostly concerned with weighty philosophic issues or emotional issues in a rather kind of prosy way. And I think something about writing in an unbroken line brings you vis-a-vis the reality, the reality of what we must call phenomenology, the nature of consciousness in that way. And what I find is, again, abandoning that, you know, paratextual apparatus does bring me, I find it much easier to write voice. It's as simple as that.
You wrote Zach Lister before you
Yes.
engaged in this particular form.
It really is.
And was he transformed by you using this different kind of voice?
Yeah, I mean, I started to know what he was thinking. I mean, I've had him as a character in several other narratives. But I wrote a kind of Bridgepoint book called Walking to Hollywood a few years ago that sort of, and, you know, in the past, I mean, I think that I felt that I was registering modernism to some extent, but registering more in my subject matter than in the formal aspects of the way I wrote. And when I got to this book, Walking to Hollywood, I realized I'd reached the end of the line. Specifically, and I'm talking very specifically, and the thing I want to say to any of you guys who are going to enter this competition is, stop thinking about modernism as something that happened in the 1920s. Stop thinking about it or in entering the competition by reading some high modernist writer and then trying to do the same thing. Think about your own mind. It's now. Nobody's describing you objectively. There is no third-person narrator in life. The third-person narrator is a collective projection of the idea of God. That's what it is. God's the only person who sees everything everybody does and knows everybody's thoughts, like an impersonal narrator in a novel. And that's actually, I think that's why people labour under the delusion that artists are so important. Because, you know, it's a kind of magical thinking. There are these people who conjure up God. And it's why a lot of the kind of religiosity moved into art with the decline of established religion in the late 19th century. It's all bullshit.
Okay. Well, I have another question which I'll ask you later about, does it make a difference that Zach is a psychiatrist or you're moving in a world of asylums and madness, R.D. Lang's project and so on. But we can leave that to one side and move on to Rachel, who I suspect
I think that will now. I don't want to talk about myself.
Well, I mean, what I think what's very interesting is that I would call you a modernist writer as well in some respects. But of course the project is completely different from what Will is doing, and I think that's what's so interesting.
I think one of the, for me, this is a true sort of phase of experience, the realisation that which is kind of like realising people don't learn anything from history, and that maybe you don't learn anything from your own experience. That art is not progressive. I've sort of wrestled with that. I mean, the majority of the contemporary writings that I read, student writings and published writings, they're written as though these texts had never existed, as though modernism had never happened. I mean, Virginia Woolf said it was, isn't it great writing a modernist novel because you don't have to explain the history of lace making, so your novel can be 150 pages long rather than 500 pages long. I mean, what Will was saying about omniscience, narrative, just narrative, whatever that is. It was done away with, and yet it's still here. It's like sort of bindweed or something. So I suppose I've come to, I mean, there's two different experiences of modernism, and one is as a reader and the other is as a writer, and they're really, really, really different. So I think as a young person, your encounters with the new, and for me this was art just as much as books, and it was music. Those are all things that are speaking to you very loudly in your village, in Suffolk, in your boarding school. You know, here's this amazing stuff, and you feel strange and you feel different from other people, and oh, you know, this is what it is, here's why. Finding that as a writer has been a completely different process and much more indexed to living. And I suppose I see the idea, I mean, Will said that modernism is a creative response to important changes. That's a very good way of putting it. But for me, that would be about life. that actually all of my development as a writer has been a creative response to important changes. That's what it's been. It's been realising that formative experience, I mean, how do we live, you know, in a kind of Jungian way? We're born into a reality bequeathed to us by other people, and we spend 40 years either trying to stay in it and then smashing it up, or gradually smashing it up. And in writing, that's, I mean, I remember, well, probably most of the things I've written, this sort of amazing frustration. Why do I write like this? Why can't I be something else? And in the end, I've only managed to become something new as a writer by living things and then understanding the form that has to come out of the living of them. And so I think that essentially, for me, probably is what modernism is. It's something that happens in your own, in the story of a person, in the history of a person, that's also happened in the history of the world. I mean, can you learn from your own history? Well, as an artist, it's as well to try to do that. I mean, I think form is the most interesting aspect of all of this. I mean, I've taught creative writing for many years, too many years, and the thing that I just did pretty randomly that actually has had the most extraordinary effect, any teaching kind of trick I ever learned. So there's a poem, I don't know if any of you know the poet Anne Carson, she's a very fantastic writer. And poetry really is, if you want a bit more of a razor's edge on these things, poetry is the place to look for it. Anyway, she does very interesting things with form, and she wrote something called The Glass Essay. It's a very long autobiographical book in poetic, novel prose in poetic form, and about herself, about her mother having, was it her father having Alzheimer's, and herself and her, anyway, that story. And I instructed my students and instructed them repeatedly to write something in this form. And it's amazing what the form does to the student, how it liberates them, how it permits them, how it shows them what to do, how it completely releases them from everything old and conventional and puts them in the driving seat of their writing persona. So form is very powerful. When you find the right one, it's a very powerful thing. So this novel is the result of me probably thinking I would never write anything again. Because I could not imagine how the various twists and turns that I come to in living, how I would ever find a form to describe that. And in the end, I wrote a book about teaching, about a writer teaching a creative writing class, which doesn't sound very promising. Anyway, and I sort of can't quite, I had a way of describing this book that would have made it a bit clearer to you, but anyway, I'll read a bit of it. So what's happening in this passage is that the students have been set an assignment, which is to write a story involving an animal. And so nobody writes anything in these creative writing classes. What they do is talk, and the whole book is about talking. I suppose my version of what Will says, this form that he's found is his experience of existence and consciousness. And for me, there's something I've noticed, because I suppose I've increasingly spent a lot of time just listening to people talk, how much of reality is created by just verbally, and that a lot of the desire to write is, I think, a verbal desire to talk. Anyway, not for me it's not, but for a lot of people I think it is. So nobody writes anything, they just talk. And this is the contribution of, it's set in Athens, by the way. This is the contribution of a student called Sylvia. I hope it's not too long. Sylvia said she had written nothing at all. Her contribution yesterday, if I recalled, had in fact concerned an animal, the small white dog she had seen perched on the shoulder of the tall, dark man. But after the others had spoken, she wished she had chosen something more personal, something that would have allowed her to express an aspect of her own self, rather than a sight that was asking, as it were, to be seen. She had looked out for that man again on the train home, as it happened, feeling that she had something to say to him. She wanted to tell him to take the dog off his shoulder and let it walk, or better still, get a dog that was ordinary and ugly, so that people like her wouldn't feel so distracted from their own lives. She resented him for his attention-seeking behaviour, and for the fact that he had made her feel so uninteresting. And now here she was, mentioning him in class for the second time. Sylvia had a small, pretty, anxious face and great quantities of ash-coloured hair worn in maidenly rolls and tresses, which she touched and patted frequently around her shoulders. In any case, she continued, she obviously didn't see him again on the way home, because life wasn't like that. She returned to her apartment, which, since she lives alone, was exactly as she had left it that morning. The telephone rang. It was her mother, who always phones her at that time. How was school today? Her mother wanted to know. Sylvia works as a teacher of English literature at a school in the suburbs of Athens. Her mother had forgotten she had the week off to do the writing course. I reminded her of what I'd been doing, Sylvia said. Of course, my mother is very sceptical about writing, so it's typical that she wouldn't remember. You should have gone on holiday instead, she said. You should have gone out to one of the islands with some friends. You should be living, she said, not spending more time thinking about books. To change the subject, I said to her, Mum, tell me something you've noticed today. That was the writing assignment they'd had the day before. What would I have noticed, she said. I spent all day in the house, waiting for the man to come and fix the washing machine. He never even turned up, she said. After our conversation, I went and looked at my computer. I had set my students an essay assignment, and the deadline had now passed. But when I checked my emails, I saw that not a single one of them had sent the essay. It was an essay about Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, the book that has inspired me more than anything else in my life, and none of them had a single word to say about it. I went and stood in my kitchen, she continued, and thought about trying to write a story. But all I could think of was a line describing the exact moment I was living in. A woman stood in her kitchen and thought about trying to write a story. The problem was that that line didn't connect to any other line. It hadn't come from anywhere, and it wasn't going anywhere either, any more than I was going anywhere by just standing in my kitchen. So I went to the other room and took a book off the shelf, a book of short stories by D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence is my favourite writer, she said. In fact, even though he's dead, in a way I think he's the person I love most in all the world. I would like to be a D.H. Lawrence character living in one of his novels. The people I meet don't even seem to have characters. And life seems so rich when I look at it through his eyes. Yet my own life very often appears sterile, like a bad patch of earth, as if nothing will grow there, however hard I try. The story I started to read, she said, was called The Wintry Peacock. It's an autobiographical story, she said, in which Lawrence is staying in a remote part of the English countryside in winter. And one day, when he's out on a walk, he hears an unusual sound and discovers that it's a peacock trapped out on the hillside, submerged in the snow. He returns the bird to its owner, a strange woman at a nearby farm who's waiting for her husband to return home from the war. At this point, she said, I stopped reading. For the first time, I felt that Lawrence was going to fail to transport me out of my own life. Perhaps it was the snow, or the strangeness of the woman, or the peacock itself. But suddenly I felt that these events, and the world he described, had nothing to do with me, here in my modern flat in the heat of Athens. For some reason, I couldn't bear it any longer, the feeling that I was the helpless passenger of his vision. So I closed the book, she said, and I went to bed.
Wonderful. Let me pose a couple of questions directly to you. I mean, the structure of this book, I know one is not meant to talk about things like structure, but I found the structure of this book absolutely fascinating because, in fact, there's a kind of absent presence of the teacher character, and her teaching is actually a way into the lives and the stories, if you like, of all the others. And so it sort of goes on. And then I read somewhere that you'd said, and I'm going to quote you, that autobiography, this is, I think, after you'd written your memoirs, autobiography is increasingly the only form in all the arts. Description and character are dead or dying, in reality as well as in art. And I somehow wanted you to try and tie up what you've done with this woman who's reading D.H. Lawrence and then stops, and your central narrator in this, and that statement. Is it something you still believe? I mean, do you think that autobiography is the only form that's left? And we cannot create character because we don't have it.
I mean, how can you progress how can you progress any art form? It's really, really difficult to tell the truth. It's really difficult to find a truthful form that is about that isn't about the past, that isn't, as Will said, that isn't, the indent and the quote marks and the, although some of those things, those things still adhere to me. I've been so formed by them that I can't get rid of them. So I think it's almost like you're looking for a sort of gap in the fence, a little way through, and it's really, really, really hard to find it. And increasingly, I can spend 2 or 3 years thinking about form, and 2 or 3 weeks. I wrote this book in 3 weeks. Once I've understood what I'm doing, writing is neither here nor there. It's trying to find the thing that isn't a lie, I suppose. And I think I've watched lots of artists in different forms coming to that same conclusion. About autobiography. Because, if you get to the point where you cannot write in all seriousness, John got up from the kitchen table and left the room. If you actually can't do that anymore, which basically I can't. And I think, again, it's like a midlife crisis. I think you reach a point where you just don't believe it anymore. You just can't believe it. And the only source of truth is yourself. That's where that inability to fantasize leaves you. I'm sure there's another way which is to do with information, to do with knowledge, to do with concrete things. But I haven't found that way. I only found this lack of, I can only find authenticity in my own experiences, I guess. I can only guarantee it.
So, Will, how does that resonate with you? I mean, this is a kind of character is no longer possible. But yet, I go away as a reader from both of these books, and I think they have very strong characters. I mean, you know, Wilson, your character is an extraordinarily dense and lively character. Yet he's made up of all these modern instruments.
I should have said character as well. Well, I very much agree with Rachel, and I think that
That's a wise thing to do.
Since we're talking to people who are potentially going to be entering a competition thinking about their own writing, I want to say to you, you can have a midlife crisis at any age. You don't have to wait until middle age. And I completely agree with Rachel. I think we had the same thing happen to us. We found that we couldn't suspend disbelief, not just in our own writing, but possibly in any writing at all. That was a real kind of problem. I found that simply getting rid of some of the conventions of fiction as it tends to be written now was enough. It actually just liberated me. But I think I wrote this sort of transitional book where I was exploring what a kind of different style might be like, and then I kind of launched it out in that way. But it was a response to the same sort of problem. I don't think, though, that the ability of the novel to create character is imperiled. I think narrative is a different problem. Now, what do we mean by narrative? I mean, put boldly, narrative is just a succession of events. Right? Fine. It's not actually what we mean. What we mean when we talk about narrative is, you know, stuff that makes you read on, actually. So it's either a MacGuffin or it's some kind of incentive to kind of move through. And that's kind of not like life, right? Life doesn't have many incentives for you to go on living. No, not quite in that way. Maybe it does. Maybe narrative does in some sense correspond to ideas of wish fulfillment, or the idea that, you know, we'll get the boy, we'll get the girl, or, you know, whatever it is. I slightly suspect that Rachel's resiling character is because you are what you eat when you're a writer. I mean, just to give you an example, a few years ago I wrote a gay novel. When I was writing a gay novel, I was gay. And as soon as, no, I was gay. I was so gay, I even wrote an article in the paper saying, everybody's gay.
We are all gay.
Why don't people get over this gay straight on? Everyone's gay. And I published a novel. My friend John came back from holiday and said, everybody on the beach at Mykonos is reading your book. And I thought, well, I've got a hit on my hands, what with everybody being gay. I mean, that's like it's just going to clean up. Then the sales figures came in and it sold a fraction of my own books. And it's like, it's typical. We're bourgeois oubliists. I thought, oh no, everybody isn't gay. And stuff came out of it at that point. So I thought that we are what we eat. When Pastor Rachel's written this book, has this conceit around the idea of an absent but present character. At the moment, she doesn't believe in character. Look at that. But I do think there is something going on with...
So you will next write a realist novel with a he and she and omniscient creative.
No, but I mean, one thing that's notable about these books, Umbrella and Sharp, is that they've got really strong narratives. They actually tell stories. Now, I don't think that abandoning the convention of the third person writer or writing in a continuous with your tenses there, rather than just say, sorry, all right.
No, and I've fucked it up as well in certain places. I can't get it all out, but every time I look at it, I think I know. Because it's so.
I mean, they were all in there. There was the historic past, the continuous present, the blue perfect. I spotted them all. So, and I thought, there's a woman.
It was really fun.
But in a way, I understand what you're doing. You're trying to get to now, really, to this nowness we're all in. But I don't think that adopting these stratagems need that we cannot have the consolation of narrative or plot at all. But it does mean that we need to think about plot in a different way and arrive at it in a different way. The original modernists, or the first modernists, were very much responding to, they were a counter-enlightenment movement, and they saw narrative as being part of a dominant ideological construction. Tony Blair would love narrative. Things can only get better. That's narrative that Wolfe and Joyce and Wyndham Lewis are assaulting. They're saying, no, things can't only get better. Things may just go around again and be exactly the same. So you have to kind of bury narrative, you have to introduce a sinuosity into narrative that I think most kind of texts, fiction texts just don't possess. What they mostly start with is a succession of events, and then they try and put into that succession of events something to keep people interested in.
Well, I think maybe the wrong elements of, let's say that modernism, it's another way of looking at it, is a sort of democratic assertion that life has form, that it doesn't need to be Judeo-Christian form. It doesn't, narrative doesn't need to be a story that actually, if you pay attention to every single person's experience, there you find amazing degrees of form, which is again, my current obsession.
But it's you giving us the amazingness of that individual person's experience. And I would suggest that you have learned a great deal about writing by the doing of it, and by the reading of it. And so it brings me back to this question of modernism. You say modernism is now. Now in the present tense. But I could say to you, I could turn around and say, that's a stylistic conceit. And that, in fact, our minds, our inner stream, is as much shaped by the kinds of books we read as it is by this conceit of the continuous present. So I may have an inner narrative which actually does work more like Van Zap. I don't know, not saying it does, but it might. And I may have, reams of garbage about making lace and paper.
Yeah, that's just you read too many books. You read too many books written by people who read too many books.
It's like foot and mouth disease.
There are too many characters that read too many books.
I don't believe. I think you and I could do a little table tennis about the books we've read, and you'd win.
Actually, I think that's quite superficial. People do, when you talk to them, they may say, ooh, and then I met him at Paddington. It was an amazing coincidence, and we've been married for 42 years, and I love him. But actually, it wasn't an amazing coincidence that they met in Paddington Station. It is named Paddington Station. And she had retrospectively imposed a narrative construction on her experience in order to make sense of it and validate it. The reality is we just wander around bumping into things.
Okay, I would like to argue this, but I will not, because it's your turn. And Rachel might want to argue it too. Please, questions from you about what's been said, but also about things that may not yet have been said, to do with modernism and writers that you think may or may not fall into that very large bracket.
Come on, kids. Good man.
So, like, the self-awareness in postmodernism.
Could you stand and speak up? Sorry, because it's. Oh, here it comes. There is a microphone.
Wrong microphone, boys.
It's coming on from the other side. It's coming the road there. We can turn up the house lights if there's somebody to turn them up.
Right, so about the sort of self-awareness of postmodernism, we talked a bit about like a British traditional form, about like writing like we're still like anachronisms completely everywhere. But do you think that that's interlinked with like sort of really consumeristic, self-aware market culture we've got? Do you think that's why, and about Americans as well, do you think in Britain we're more stifled by that?
Well, I think postmodernism is an attempt to smuggle, pre-modernist attributes back into the novel. I mean, postmodern things look kind of funky and weird and different, but just like postmodern architecture, they're actually made up of things that have been borrowed from previous forms. So they're kind of an attempt to get back to it. And yes, I agree with you. It's like marketing. This is kind of wacky and new. Maybe we can flog in new books. It's not a creative response to modernity. That's the problem. Modernity is still with us, and people are not responding to it. They're actually failing to respond to it.
It feels like narcissistic as well.
Postmodernism.
Like the attempt to sort of intellectually flog intellectualism that doesn't really get anywhere.
They tend to be books about books by definition. Books about books is, I think, I remarked to the outset, shit. And what we want to write about is, this is why we're writers, isn't it? It's like what we feel and think about the world, and what we see other people seem to be feeling and thinking about the world, and how we interact with them. That's what we want to write about. We want to get to that. And yeah, some of our intellectual life is bound up with different kinds of artistic forms, and that has a certain amount of interest to it, but it's not nearly as interesting as the way in which indigestion can ruin your day. It isn't actually.
There's a question down here. Put your hand up again. That's all right.
Well, I have a microphone here. If you say
Because there are people up there who need you.
Okay. I was wondering about, you said that modernism is a response to modernity, but then characterised it as just being, like, the continuous present being the right way to express our consciousness in the way that we experience life. And surely our consciousness and the way we experience the world hasn't really changed as a result of sort of technological innovation or discovery of relativity theory. So I wondered why modernism is actually a response, or if it is a response to technological innovation or change, or if it's just a sort of right way to do novels, and George Eliot should have written her novels in modernist style.
Oh, no, there were elements of modernism going all the way back in the literary tradition. In fact, the novel itself is initially modernist. It's modern. If you read something like Sterne's Sentimental Journey through France and Italy, that is you'd be hard pressed not to read that as a modernist text. Why is it modernist? It's responding to the new form. The novel takes a while to become a novel, and in its early stages it's wild and wacky, and it's responding to its own modernity, its own innovation. Do I think people have substantially changed in the way they experience the world because of technology? Damn right I do. Absolutely. Cognitively, psychologically, our sense of who we are as individuals, the incredible narcissism of our culture. I mean, arguably, the whole kind of cult of the individual is really quite a new phenomenon. Just to give you one example, Graham Robb, writing this book, the Invention of France, has this really telling little detail that in the 19th century, most kind of poor and even middle-class families who had a photo album wouldn't have photographs of children because they died. So you didn't waste a photographic claim on a child. They wouldn't necessarily be around. You didn't want to be reminded of them once they died. Now, that's very different to our own era, where, we now take as many photographic images in a year as in all of preceding history of photography. What the fuck were you photographing? Yeah? You're actually there, you don't have to photograph it. No, psychically we are not the same. I mean, we are fundamentally the same, but there are a lot of differences. And I think modernism does
was talking about is proliferation, really. I mean, that is a... I mean, why is it that we're allowed to... being allowed to describe consciousness, for instance, I think I used the word democracy before, or democratisation. I mean, it's the same as as other freedoms. We're all allowed to do all sorts of things now that George Eliot wasn't allowed to do, and that includes write about the individual in a more honest way. So I don't think it's so much to do with people changing as to do with freedom, rights, less stuffiness. It's really amazing that Lady Chatterley's Lover could only be read in the 1960s. I was reading it the other day, and I mean that seems so. I think these things are still quite they're sort of worth defending or worth remembering or something.
And I mean, to add to that, there's a very different division between the public and the private. I mean, even from the high moment of Joyce to now, and what you can put into the public domain is completely different from what it was then. What was daring then cannot be daring now.
I'm sure that could go backwards in an instant.
One of the problems with the history of modernism is that it got confused, and I slightly disagree with you, Rachel. It got confused with this issue of the representation, particularly of sexuality and the visceral aspects of human life. Because one of the things that happened is after the Chatterley trial, once it became acceptable to represent the reality of human sexuality and the embodiment, people thought modernism was over. They confused the battle for articulating those things in the public forum with the actual techniques of registering the impact of modernity in a broader sense. So, people started to think, well, I can look at porn on the internet, I don't need modernism. That's kind of, no, really, at some kind of weird level, whereas in fact modernism is really about that exactly. It's about something.
Well, no, but I think what I was trying to describe more was the cruelty of the earlier world, I guess. The cruelty of the Victorian world, cruel to art and cruel to people.
I'm teaching some students Wolves to the Lighthouse next week, and that's pretty crimped. I mean, she can't call a spade in that book. She's meant to be writing about somebody's internal thoughts, but Mrs. Ramsay never actually says she's horny. Even to herself, she can't say she wants a bath.
Because these things are not articulated.
What?
These things are not articulated, even by the individual.
No, it's like living under a Stalinist regime. You're worried about a thought crime. Think about that.
Okay, time for 2 more questions, I think.
You can ask them both.
One there first, and then you.
So we know you think of postmodernism. Do you think late modernism is a thing, a late modernist writer, and if so, how would you define that?
Well, I think late modernist writers will be working in. I mean, you don't mean late modernist in the sense of late capitalism, in Horkheimer's.
No.
You mean a late period of modernism. Well, you have
is there a mode of modernism that is reacting against certain techniques as displayed by high modernists like Joyce, like Woolf, that's actually doing something very different? I was thinking particularly in terms of dialogue, like a move back towards dialogue, for example, in Patrick Hamilton or someone like that. Just wanted to know what you had to say on late modernism.
Patrick Hamilton?
Yeah.
What? Hangover Square?
Slaves in Solitude.
He's a modernist. I'm like,
I think
I don't
Rachel
know who I am. Nick McManus, the wrestler on World of Sport. You remember him?
I don't.
No, I don't think it's... My hunch is modernism will endure, like all the other major aesthetic eras of Western civilization, for about half a millennium. So if you want to get back to me in kind of 2414, we can talk about late modernism.
But can't the two exist together?
Well, no, I mean, it's sort of what Rachel said earlier on, and you're falling into what I call the critical fallacy, which is it's all about intertextuality. It's all about a response to what other artists have done. And think I said from the get-go, I write about the world, not about other books. So I'm not really reacting to modernism in quite that way.
I want Rachel to take this up if she...
I wonder whether drama is a more sort of fertile, has more examples of what you're talking about. I was thinking about sort of Eugene O'Neill, sort of Arthur Miller, that maybe that return to realism in the dramatic form. And then, you know, Raymond Carver. I mean, I mean, to me, those things sort of lead to each other. Go on. Yeah, right.
Later, when Brad picked up the scissors and put it in the back of the pickup, I wondered why he'd shot Butch. Butch wasn't bothering anybody. He was just being, I mean, fuck that. Anything that easy to parry.
Okay, think about... well, but that's an interesting point, because I think there is a kind of idea of modernism. You know, there's the modernist plenty, which is effectively what you're talking about, which is the modernism of a kind of overflowing consciousness in which life comes in and out as a sensation.
Yeah, and which has a lot to answer for in terms of mediocrity of contemporary fiction. You know, modernism has left a, you know, bad legacy.
But there is the other modernism, which is about minimalism.
Absolutely ridiculous. The only people who are to blame for the parlous condition of contemporary fiction are the swine writers. You can't blame a kind of aesthetic movement for creating something. Somebody has to actually pick up the pen and start making them up. And they're to blame.
I don't think you don't look happy with this.
I think when I said I was talking about late modernism not as a conscious I'm going to react against other writers, but as a different way of processing the idea of consciousness as a reaction to the changes that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And what I mean is that in certain books you see really distinct techniques, whereas in other slightly later books, drastically different ones, both of which are coming under the kind of umbrella of modernism. And I was just asking whether you thought that late modernism was a valuable term in its own right.
Well, I don't personally, but I understand what you're talking about, and it is a valid point. There have been other ways of responding to this problem of modernity. I mean, I think some of the, you know, there's some kind of concrete poetry and prose is trying to respond to it, by a lot of writers like the late Gordon Byrne, who introduced a lot of media into the form. So actually, Jimmy J did that from the get-go. So it's not that original, but you know.
What about Ballard?
David Peace, people like that. I can see what they're driving at. They're trying to float my boat, but they're not much dancers.
But what about Ballard? I mean, just very quickly, because there is a sense.
Well, I would just say Ballard is a modernist writer, and leave it at that.
Okay, but not in the terms that we've been necessarily talking about here.
But his fiction is all about a response to modernity. Actually, it's an inverted response to modernity, because actually what Ballard did do is largely get rid of character. He's only interested in characters as hieratic figures. And that's because what he believed about contemporary life. He believed actually that people's subjectivity wasn't that interesting. He thought they were to be told. So do I.
One more question.
I wanted to kind of steer us a bit away from fiction, and I'm doing an autobiography module at the moment, and we're doing some modernist autobiographies. And I wanted to ask, first of all, does the panel think that there is such a thing as a modernist autobiography? And second of all, if either of you two were to begin to write an autobiography as, let's say, modernist writers, where would you even begin?
Rachel.
Is there such a thing as a modernist autobiography? Well, what is an autobiography? I mean, so many. I think that this is probably not so true in the novel, but I mean, just like Anne Carson, for instance, who I was talking about earlier. Her work is autobiographical. Her impulse is autobiographical. She said something really interesting about knowledge, and scholarship, and so she's a great classicist and translates, Aeschylus. But that she felt that was a defence against subjectivity, and that and that this was her great fear, that her autobiographical impulse was just a sort of blancmange of subjectivity if it didn't have this sort of classical structure that she has sort of bolted it onto. So I think there is a lot of autobiography in modern writing. What would a modern autobiography be? I mean, I've sort of gone on the record too many times talking about Carl Nausgaard. I don't know if you've read Carl Nausgaard, Norwegian. Wrote a 6-volume account. He's 46 and has written these many thousands of pages about his life. And that is it. I mean, it's modernist in the sense that he, rather as we were talking about, could not believe anymore in writing fiction, and that autobiography isn't. So maybe I think you need a new word. Maybe there needs to be a new word. I mean, I'm also quite fond of W.G. Sebald. I don't know if you've read it. So, and he writes these sort of quasi-autobiographical books in which you feel that everything that he is observing outside himself is in fact himself. And so that's another, it's a sort of dignified way of doing it. I mean, one of the things that I meant to say earlier was that, I mean, just looking at the winners, the top 3 from last year, which I thought were really good and really interesting. But just how important imitation is in your develop. I mean, that's how you learn how to do things, is by imitating other people, and it's not a bad way to learn. I think when you're so I actually think maybe imitating modernist texts as a young writer. I wish I'd done that anyway. I wish I'd. If there is a reason to.
Would you put Proust into your modernist autobiography?
Yeah, I suppose for me the real revolution in my writing did happen when I read Proust, and that was not until I was in my 30s, and I thought, okay, it's all about permission. It's all about working out what you're allowed to do, and it's really amazing how you can not know you're allowed to do certain things, even though you live in the world in 2014, with loads of other people who do know you're allowed to, but formative experience is such a manacle on the mind, and how do you, and maybe you haven't experienced that quite so much as I have, but I think that if I had imitated people earlier, just done that, like someone sitting in the Louvre imitating whatever, I would have got further faster.
Lady Smith always says that this was formative for her.
Yeah.
I mean, actually doing a kind of pastiche.
Yeah, because I think there's still some pretty good forms around that are sitting around, like antiques, and you can just use them. Why go to IKEA? You can use the old thing. Sorry, I have not at all answered your question, but I don't really know how to answer your question.
Okay, I think we're going to have to draw this to a close. I know we haven't answered a great many of the questions that one could raise in this area, but I hope it sparked some, attentive interest in you. And we all hope that there will be many, many entries to the modernism competition. I don't know whether Lara would like to have a final word. Okay, well, thank you very much to... Oh.
Go upstairs.
There are drinks upstairs. I'm sorry, I forgot about the drinks. And thank